Welcome back to Self-Invested, where we talk about how you can do better with money. In this video, I'm going to be talking through how leaseholders can buy the freehold of their flat, the building it's in, and the land that the building is on. A process that's known as collective enfranchisement and is actually similar to the process of extending your lease through the statutory route, which is something I've actually done a video on. If you want to see the video to that, you can have a look just above my head. There should be a card that pops out, but also I'll provide a link down in the description to this video as well. Now, if I could go back in time and I had the choice again to whether extend my lease or to buy the freehold of my property, I would definitely go for buying the freehold of my property. This is because the cost of extending your lease and the cost of buying the freehold of your property are similar costs, but with the freehold you have a lot better ownership of your property than you do when you just extend your lease. When you extend your lease, you get a much longer lease and you have to pay zero ground rent, but you still have a freeholder. So if you want to make any major or significant alterations to your flat or to your building, you need the permission of the freeholder. If you buy the freehold of your property, then you remove the freeholder out of the equation, and it's up to you and the others that you share the freehold with to make decisions on how you manage the building and what you do with it. Just so you know, I'll provide a list of the different subjects or topics that I'm covering in this video on screen now. I'm not going through them in any particular order. I'm just going to be talking about the different things that you need to do in order to extend your lease. The information that I'm using for this video has come from the Lease Advice Service website, which I'll link down in the description below, and also the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership website. The Leasehold Knowledge Partnership website has the same information as the Lease Advice Service website, but it has additional information. It's almost as though they've taken all the information from the Lease Advice website and added to it with their own knowledge. So if you go to any website, go to the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership website. So yeah, you can find a link down in the description to that website. Collective enfranchisement is the process where you and your fellow leaseholders group together to buy the freehold of your property. Now, in order to be able to buy the freehold of your property, you need at least 50% of your leaseholders in the building to take part in the process. But if 50% of you do take part, then you still need to buy 100% of the property. So say, for example, there was a building with 4 leaseholders and the cost of buying the freehold or the share of the freehold for each of the tenants would be 2,500, so 10,000 in total. If only 2 of the tenants wanted to take part, then those 2 would still have to pay 10,000, so they would have to pay for the whole freehold cost in order to buy the freehold. They won't just be able to buy their share of the freehold. And after that happens, if only 2 of the leaseholders have bought the freehold of the property, then they'll become the landlords or the freeholders of the other 2 tenants or the other 2 leaseholders in that building. The first criteria is that the building must contain at least 2 flats. So this rules out leasehold houses, because unless it's been converted into 2 separate flats, then you won't be able to use this process to buy the freehold of a leasehold of a leasehold house. The second is that 2/3 of the flats within the building need to be qualifying tenants. A qualifying tenant is a tenant that had an initial lease length of 21 years. So the lease could have less than 21 years at the time you plan to buy the freehold of your property, but the initial length of the lease needs to have been at least 21 years. Now, in most cases, leaseholders will qualify on this basis because most leases start off at 99 years or 125 years. Now, shared owners need to have staircased to 100%. They can't own any less than 100% of their property. Also, if a leaseholder owns more than 2 flats in their building, then they're disqualified from this process. So if if there's a tenant in your building and they own 3 or more flats within the building, then they're disqualified. All of their flats are disqualified, and they won't be able to qualify as part of the 2/3 number you need to be able to buy the freehold. The last criteria for a qualifying tenant is that they can't have a commercial lease. So this means that they can't have a lease for a business such as an office or a retail shop. They must have a residential lease. The next criteria is that the building that you're buying the freehold of needs to have 25% or less of non-residential use. So say your building had a shop on the ground floor, or there were offices as part of your building. The offices or the business, the non-residential use, can't add up to more than 25% of the whole building. If the non-residential use of the building adds up to more than 25%, then you won't qualify for the enfranchisement process. So the last criteria is that there must not be a resident landlord, and there's something called a resident landlord exemption. A resident landlord exemption is where the building that you're buying is a conversion into 4 or fewer flats and is not a purpose-built block, and the same person has owned the freehold since before the conversion of the building into flats, and they or an adult member of their family has lived there for the past 12 months. If you have a resident landlord that meets each one of those criteria, this means that your building doesn't qualify for the collective enfranchisement process. I think it's very rare where you'll find that somebody will be able to stop you from buying the freehold of your property because of the resident landlord exemption. Now, according to the Lease Advice Service website and the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership website, the best way to start the collective enfranchisement process is to draw up a participation agreement. Now, a participation agreement governs the actions prior and during the collective enfranchisement process. It will govern the rights of voting, the negotiation and agreement of terms, so how you're going to agree and negotiate the terms of the collective enfranchisement process, and most importantly, each individual leaseholder's contribution to the financial cost of buying the freehold of your property. According to the Lease Advice Service, if you're in a small block, then you can get away with not getting a participation agreement up front. The alternative would be for every one of the participating leaseholders to put their money up front into an account so that there's no need to have a participation agreement. You basically put all your money up at the start and you set it aside to buy the freehold of your property. The only thing with this is that you probably will need to get a surveyor at the beginning to give you an idea of what it will cost to buy your freehold, and add maybe 20 or 10% more on top of what the surveyor thinks is going to cost in the worst case scenario, just so you know that everyone has the money to pay for the freehold if it costs more than expected. But in my personal opinion, I think the best way to go with this is to get a solicitor on board and to get them to draw up a formal participation agreement which governs the processes of how you're going to vote if you need to make a decision, and also how you're going to negotiate and agree the terms and the cost of buying the freehold of your property. And in that agreement as well, which will be legally binding, it will also set out what each participant's contribution to the financial cost of buying your freehold will be. I think that is the safest way to go because it protects everyone taking part. It'll be difficult for anyone to take advantage of anyone else or to change their mind if there's something in writing that's legally binding that every one of the participants need to adhere to. If you buy the freehold of your property, you'll need to nominate a purchaser of the freehold property. Now, this is going to be the person whose name goes on to the notice that's sent to the freeholder informing them that you plan to buy the freehold of your property. And it's also going to be the person or the entity that the freehold is transferred to. Now, this can be any one of the participants taking part in the collective enfranchisement process, but most commonly it's a company that's set up wholly owned by each of the participants taking part. And this company acts as the nominee purchaser in the process. Now, I think this is probably the best way to go, rather than nominating an individual leaseholder to be the nominee purchaser. I would be much more comfortable with having a company take the form of the nominee purchaser, and for each person taking part in the process to be an equal member of that company. I think in that situation, there's no one person that has more control over the process than any other, and everyone is an equal owner of that company, and so will be an equal owner of the freehold once it's acquired. Now, it's also suggested that when you start this process, that you put together an initial cost fund or a frightened fund, just to cover the initial cost that you're going to incur in the collective enfranchisement process. Now, this is going to be cost to hire a solicitor and also for a surveyor. And this initial frightened fund can probably be around £1,000 or £2,000, and something that everyone at the start equally contributes to, just to make sure that you can put together your participation agreement and find out how much it's going to cost to buy your freehold, and see whether everyone is actually in a position to be able to buy the freehold of the property. You're going to need two professional services in order to make this work properly. You can do it without hiring these two professionals or these two professional services, but it's recommended both by the Lease Advice Service and the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership that you use the services of a solicitor and a surveyor. This is just to make sure that you don't get any of the steps wrong in the process of buying a freehold, because if you get it wrong, it can prove costly to you. You may have to cover your freeholder's costs for dealing with this matter, even if you don't buy the freehold of your property. And also, it can delay you by up to 12 months if you do something incorrectly. The surveyor is going to help you estimate what the cost of buying the freehold will be. Now, they'll give you a best case and a worst case scenario. In my experience, you're very likely to pay close to the worst case scenario when you go through the process. But ideally, you want to get somewhere in between the best case and the worst case scenarios. Now, your surveyor will also be able to advise you on the condition of the building and any maintenance requirements that you will need to be aware of when you take possession of the building. And so that's something that they'll be able to advise you as part of their service. So I'm guessing that will probably be an additional cost, but it's probably something worth getting advice on, so that when you take ownership of the building, you can make sure that you maintain that building properly. You can also get your surveyor to negotiate on your behalf when it comes to negotiating the cost of the freehold. When you make your initial offer to the freeholder, they're probably going to throw back an amount that's a lot more than your initial offer with their counter offer, and you can hire or you can pay for your surveyor to negotiate on your behalf to get you a better deal. When I extended my lease, I actually negotiated my lease premium by myself without the surveyor, because the surveyor, I think, was going to charge something like £200 an hour or something that was quite costly, and I thought any cost that he was able to reduce the premium that I would pay to the freeholder will probably be eaten up by the cost of him actually negotiating on my behalf. So I did a lot of research and I got a good understanding of how the premium was calculated, and I knew what a reasonable cost of my lease extension was, and on that basis I was comfortable with negotiating with the freeholder. But if you're not comfortable with doing that, you can get your surveyor to negotiate on your behalf. You also need a solicitor for this process, or it's highly advised or highly recommended that you get a solicitor for this process, and the solicitor can help you form a participation agreement at the start when you're agreeing the terms of your agreement with the other leaseholders. They can also help you set up the nominee company or the nominee purchaser as a company, so that you all equally own that company that buys the freehold of the property. And they'll also help you work through the whole collective enfranchisement process, so serving the initial notice that you serve to the freeholder with your initial offer, and also the process from there to completion, where you actually take possession or you acquire the freehold of that property. Now, if you want to find a solicitor to help you with this process, I'll provide a link to the Law Society down in the description. But the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership does say that most of the professionals or most of the solicitors with experience in the collective enfranchisement process are in the southeast of England, so in London and around London. It's their view that location is less important than competence. So if you find somebody that's in the south of England, in the southeast of England, and you feel confident in their ability to help you and guide you through the process, you're much better going with them, even if they're located far away from you, because what you're looking for is competency, not proximity. And if we've learned anything during this whole period of lockdown, it's that we can, or people can, work effectively remotely. So it's not something to worry too much about their location. The main thing is that they're capable of doing the job. Now, once you've appointed your solicitor and before you serve your initial notice, you're going to have to gather quite a bit of information, which is going to be used in the initial notice. Now, this information will include the identity of the freeholder and also the identity of the other leaseholders in your property. This is just to make sure that your initial notice is valid and correct. And it's also to be prepared for if you need to respond to any queries from the landlord. Now, it's highly advised that you use a solicitor when it comes to gathering the information and serving the initial notice, because if you get this wrong, then the freeholder can prevent you from buying the freehold for another 12 months. And if you have to wait another 12 months before you can serve another notice, it means that the cost of buying the freehold of your property is going to be more costly, because the lease length is going to be less, and there's a potential that your property may have grown in value as well. Now, the next step in the process is serving the notice. Now, this is the initial notice where you'll be making an offer to the freeholder to buy the freehold of their property. The offer that you put in the initial notice is usually the minimum estimate that you got from your surveyor. Now, it's sensible to use the minimum offer that the surveyor gave in their estimate rather than anything lower than that. Because if you offer something that's too low, there's a chance that the freeholder can argue that the offer that you made is not realistic, and on that basis try to reject your offer. And if they reject your offer and that rejection's upheld, then you won't be able to serve another initial notice for 12 months. So it doesn't make sense to try and lowball anything lower than the minimum offer that is stated in the estimates given by your surveyor. Now, it's important that your initial notice doesn't have any inaccuracies. Now, this is another reason why it's important to get a solicitor on board, because if there are any inaccuracies, sometimes you can apply to your county court to get your initial notice amended. But there are situations where if you get any information or anything inaccurate in your initial notice, the freeholder can reject your notice and stop you from being able to serve another initial notice for 12 months, which, as I said, is going to prove more costly for you to buy the freehold of your property. Now, it's also recommended that when you serve your initial notice to the freeholder, that you also notify the land registry of your intention to buy the freehold of the property. Now, this will guard against the freeholder transferring ownership of the freehold to somebody else, because if they do that during the process of you buying the freehold and the land registry is not notified, then the information on your initial notice can become incorrect or invalid or out of date, and the freeholder could then use that as an opportunity to say that the information on your initial notice is incorrect, and so try to reject your initial notice. Now, once the initial notice is served on your freeholder, this sets the valuation date. So even if it takes a year to buy the freehold, the amounts that you pay and the cost of the freehold is going to be based on the date that is stated in the initial notice. So you won't have to pay more to buy the freehold of your property because your lease is run down over a year if it takes a year to buy your freehold, because the process and the valuation dates are set at the date stated in the initial notice. After the freeholder receives your initial notice stating you are exercising your right to buy the freehold of your property, your landlord can ask for additional information to prove that you have the right to buy the freehold of your property. Now, if your freeholder wants to request any additional information, they must request that information within 21 days of the date stated in the initial notice. If they do request any information, then you need to respond with that information within 21 days of their request. If you fail to respond to their request for information, it's taken as though you were withdrawing your initial notice. And if your initial notice is withdrawn and because you haven't responded within 21 days of the request, you won't be able to serve another initial notice for another 12 months. Now, your landlord must respond by the date stated in your initial notice. In the lease extension process, this is usually 2 months after the official date of the initial notice. If they don't respond within that period, then you're able to apply to the county court and buy the freehold of your property for the offer stated in your initial notice. But more times than not, they will respond to your initial notice, and they'll either respond by saying that they agree to your right to buy the freehold and either agree to your terms or counter your terms with their own terms. So that's usually them asking for more money, or they say that they don't agree to your right to buy the freehold of your property, and in that situation you'll need to go to a county court for them to determine whether you do or don't have the right. But they might not do either of those two things. They might not admit that you have a right or deny that you have a right. They might just apply to the county court with proof that they had a planned redevelopment. Now, if they can prove that they were planning to redevelop the freehold or the land that the freehold is on, then they don't have to sell the property, but they need to prove that it was their intention to redevelop the site before you serve that initial notice. So it's a good idea not to have a conversation with your freeholder before you plan to serve that initial notice. The initial notice should be the first time that they hear of your intention to buy the freehold. If you fail to agree terms with the freeholder during the negotiation process, then after 2 months after the counter notice is served, then both of you, the freeholder and you, the leaseholders, will be able to apply to tribunal to get the court to determine what price you should pay to buy the freehold of your property. But as I mentioned, this can prove to be quite a costly process. So if you decide to go down that route, you need to make sure that you know what you're doing and that you're ready for the additional cost that you may pay. And it's probably a good idea to seek legal advice or to speak to your solicitors and speak to your surveyors about about the best offer on the table and whether it's worth going to tribunal. Now, if you want to find out more about the tribunal process, I'll provide a link down to the Leasehold Knowledge Partnership website where they go into more detail about the tribunal process. Now, before I go, I just want to cover some other key points about the collective enfranchisement process, which I didn't mention during the different sections of the video. The first key point I want to mention is that leaseholders don't have a right to participate in the collective enfranchisement process. As long as there are 2/3 of leaseholders within a building that qualify for the collective enfranchisement process, and at least 50% grouped together to buy the freehold of that property, they don't need the permission of the other 50%. They can go ahead and start the process of buying the freehold of the whole building without the consent or participation of the other leaseholders. But as I said at the start, if you do this, then the people or the ones that are participating in buying the freehold of the property will need to pay for the full cost of the freehold. It makes a lot of sense to work with the other willing leaseholders in your building to buy the freehold of your building, because it will work out cheaper for each of the leaseholders taking part in the process if everyone's taking part, and it will probably make for a smoother process if everyone knows and is working together to buy the freehold of the property. The government have announced that they're going to make it easier and cheaper for leaseholders to buy the freehold of their buildings. Now, it's not clear exactly how this is going to work, but this means that this process that I've talked through is probably going to be simplified a bit, and it's probably going to be simplified in how the valuation for the cost of buying the freehold is calculated. The government has said that they're going to have an online calculator so that leaseholders can get an accurate idea of how much the freehold will cost. If you want to have a look at the announcement the government's made about the leasehold reforms, you can find that down in the description to this video. The last point I wanted to make, and is probably just something that I think is a good tip, is probably if you're looking to do this with other freeholders, that's by the freehold of your leasehold property, it probably makes sense to get a surveyor to do a valuation of your property first, just to make sure that everyone who takes part in the in the collective enfranchisement process has enough money to take part. And if not, they can have a look at how long it will take them to save to be able to buy, or you can work together on an arrangement for how you can all buy the freehold of your property and then potentially repay you back at a later date. That brings us to the end of the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, please let me know down in the comments. If you have any questions, please also let me know down in the comments. And remember, all the information that I used, I'll link to down in the description so you can do more reading up on. I've basically just summarized the information that was on that website. It does go into more detail. If you liked the video, please give it a like. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you at the next one. Take care. Bye.